If you missed today's notes, if you just need a quick recap, we were talking about simplifying radicals, and the basic idea is, there are certain numbers that we know how to square root. They're called perfect squares. This is a list of them, and any other number that's under a square root symbol, I can't do it. There's no way to write the answer really well. It's just not a pretty answer, and if you put it in a calculator, you're going to get a huge decimal, and that decimal is just an approximation. Even if you were to write every single decimal that showed up on the screen, it'd still be an approximation. And this is math class, so I want there to be exact answers. So the goal is anytime you're asked to square root something and it's not one of these numbers, then your job is to find the biggest one of these numbers that divides what you're square rooting evenly, and then square root that part of the number. So I'll explain it with these 6 examples that are on page 1 of your notes. The very first question, square root of 49, that is a number that's off of our list. That's a perfect square. 7 times 7 does make 49, so there's not a lot of work to do on this one. You just know that the answer is going to be 7, and we call it a day. Moving on to the next one, though, square root of 18. 18 is not a perfect square. There's not a number that I know off the top of my head that if I multiply it by itself, I get 18. So I want to start looking at this list of numbers. These are all the numbers that you can square root well, and I want to find the biggest one of these that is a factor of 18. Which one of these numbers goes into 18 evenly, and I want the biggest one. So this is the kind of, on 18 is a pretty small number. I can look at this list. I'm not going to look anything above 25 is obviously not going to be something I want to look at. So I'd start with maybe 16, but 16 does not go into 18 evenly. I'd move down to 9, and I can see that 9 does go into 18 2 times. So what I'll do is I'll rewrite that 18 as 9 times 2, because 9 times 2 makes, 18. And then we're allowed to break numbers up over multiplication. That's for square root symbols. You can break them up over multiplication, and we can square root the part that we know how. If I'm trying to find a number that multiplies by itself to make 9, that would be 3. So our final answer here would be 3. And then this, I can't do anything with it, so I'm going to leave it just like that, 3 root 2. That's a simplified version of the square root of 18. So the idea is find the biggest perfect square that divides your number evenly, and then square root that part of the number. When I move on to 500, there are, of course, bigger perfect squares than 100. We can do 11 times 11, 12 times 12, and 13 times 13. And we really could go on forever and ever and ever. But if I'm thinking about numbers off this list that go into 500 evenly, it's pretty obvious that 100 goes in 5 times. So I'm going to break this 500 up into a perfect square and whatever is left. You don't need to show the step where you break it down, where you break it apart. But you can. I recommend that you do. And then we're going to square root this part of things. This is saying what number multiplies by itself to make 100, and we know that the answer is 10. So 10 radical 5 is going to be a simplified version of the square root of 500. For 80, this is my favorite one to talk about. So when we're doing this process, we really want to find the biggest number off this list that goes into 80. And there are a couple numbers off this list that go into 80. In fact, I'll just say, if I could show my calculator on the screen, 80 is not a number I can divide quickly in my head. I can't list factors of 80 very quickly. So I might get out my calculator, and I might do things like, if I wasn't sure about 64, for example, I might on my calculator go 80 divided by 64 and see if it comes out nicely, and it won't. If I know 49 doesn't go into 80, then I won't even bother trying it. But if I wasn't sure, I would take 80 divided by 49, maybe 80 divided by 36. I want to point out that I'm starting with higher numbers and I'm working towards lower numbers. And as I do this, what I would find is this number does go into 80. And I don't necessarily know that off the top of my head, but if I do on my calculator 80 divided by 16, I can see that 5 is going to be sitting there left. I'm almost positive, right? 80 divided by 16. And just like I said, it would be 5. So I know that 80, this is the biggest perfect square I could find that goes into 80, and it goes in 5 times. So I know 16 times 5 is 80. I can then, in my head or on my paper, break up the square root over that little product, and then square root the part that I can. What's a number that multiplies by itself to make 16? 4. So my final answer is going to be 4 root 5. Now, some of you might be saying, but Mr. Depsic, when I thought about 80 and I thought about perfect squares, I realized that 4 goes into 80. 4 goes into 80 20 times. So I got the answer of 2 radical 20. And while this is technically, of course, equivalent to the square root of 80, it's not the answer I'm looking for. So math teachers like myself love to ask you questions where there might be a couple different perfect squares that go into 80, but we want you to find the biggest one. And the biggest one is 16, so I'm going to break up with 16 and 5 and do that. Okay? So we move on to 30. So this is, just to clarify, this is the correct answer for sure. And this is not 100% wrong, but it's not full credit. This is what I want to see. The biggest perfect square that goes into 80 is 16. For 30, if I start looking at these perfect squares and trying to find one that goes into 30, well, 25 doesn't go into 30, 16 doesn't, 9 doesn't, and 4 doesn't. And 1 does, but that's not helpful. There's no perfect square that goes into 30. That means my answer is just root 30. I can't simplify that one at all. It doesn't mean no solution. It doesn't mean undefined. It's like as simple as it can be, so you just write it down as your answer. You just copy the problem down again and say, that's my answer. This last one's another one where we have to be kind of careful. So if I think about numbers that go into 72, I'm going to start with the higher numbers and work lower. Now, maybe it's obvious to me that 64 doesn't go into 72. But if it wasn't, I would get a calculator out and do 72 divided by 64. Maybe it's obvious to me that 49 does not go into 72. But if it wasn't, I would get my calculator out. I would do 72 divided by 49. It would be a decimal. That's not helpful. When it comes to 36, if I get out the old calculator and I do 72 divided by 36, the calculator will tell me 2. 36 goes into 72 exactly 2 times. So that is it. That's the biggest perfect square that goes into 72. I'll rewrite 72 as 36 times 2. I'll think of it or write it down as the product broken up. I know the square root of 36 is 6. I don't know the square root of 2, so that stays under the square root. That's my final answer, 6 root 2. Again, if you were thinking to yourself, but Mr. Depsic, 4 goes into 72 and 9 goes into 72, they do. But I want the biggest perfect square that goes into 72 if I want my answer to be 100% correct. So that's the notes that you missed, or hopefully the recap's helpful. If not, there's always office hours. I'm here to help. I do much better when I'm talking face-to-face with a person than I do when I'm trying to assume what your questions might have been. So pop in Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, Friday, 3 to 3:30. The link is on the classroom page.